When you arrived in Vietnam for the second time, and let's say you've been there 2 or 3 weeks, did the war feel different? Did the situation on the ground feel different from how it had felt back in 67, 68?
Well, it definitely did because of my situation. Everyone's war was different, depending on when you went, where you went, what unit you were assigned to, who you worked with, all of that. The first time I had spent all of my time, with the exception of two or three different operations, I was either in a major bear camp base camp or the Dong Tam base camp, or living in the city of Mito. I was not living out in the country. And so when I arrived in my assignment in Quang Hoa province, I was out in the country. I was living in a small Vietnamese compound. Uh, and yes, it was definitely different for me, but I had no sense that there was any difference in the situation. So I knew, okay, it's 1971, the war's still going on. The only big difference policy wise is President Nixon's Vietnamization program had started, and the number of Americans on the ground in combat was appreciatively lower than it had been 2 years earlier, 3 years earlier. So
What was the implication through it's not just a year you extend, so it's an 18-month tour. So you leave in 73, which is, I mean, at this time, there are very, very few Americans left in South Vietnam. Um, and so for you, what was the implication of the Vietnamization policy? Who are you working with? How many Americans are around through your 18-month period?
it was profound in the sense that uh, my advisory team, the province, everybody in the province was around 175 people, Americans, uh, about half of which were in 8 of the districts, and the half was in the province team. There was obviously no large U.S. unit. The Ninth Infantry Division that I'd been in before was the first major unit to get withdrawn. Uh, the nearest Vietnamese Army division was in the city of first in Sa Dec, and then in Vinh Long, which is kind of up the river from where we were. There was no major U.S. or military organization in our province, so that was different. The fact that we were there by ourselves was not a shock to the system because we expected that, but it was sort of different. So, yes, instead of being surrounded by uh, fellow American soldiers doing much the same thing as I was out there with two other guys. So, and sometimes one other guy, and sometimes only me. So, it was different from that standpoint. My whole focus was on the Vietnamese military that I was working with.
So there were days when you were the only American
Yes, in the field.
in the field.
When I arrived in Ham Long in July of '71, the team had gone from 6 Americans to three, and we were lucky to have an NCO, so there were three of us: the district senior advisor, myself, and our operations NCO. In Mokai, there were only two: the district senior advisor and me. When I went back to Ham Long as the district senior advisor, the first 2 or 3 days it was me and my interpreter, and then they sent an NCO out, and his primary job for me was to man the radio, because when we went to the field, we were often out of contact with province. I was anyway, and so he was my radio relay. And people said, "Well, why didn't you take him to the field with you? He certainly would have gone." And he said he wanted to go. I said, "You're more important being my link, and during the times when I was back and forth, he did go out." So yes, we were one or two men for half of my tour, and three for the first 10 months.
I hear the word advisor and, take the word literally. And so I think, okay, here's an American officer who's going into the field, who's offering advice and who's counseling South Vietnamese counterparts on how they should proceed, what they should do, what tactics they should use. How, what did on the ground, what did being an advisor to South Vietnamese forces in the Mekong Delta that late in the war, 71 through 73, what did being an advisor actually mean in that context?
We did not advise. Vietnamese we worked with had far more experience fighting an insurgency than we did. They knew the war. We were there for a temporary basis. They did not need my help on tactics or planning or logistics or anything. Uh, I saw my role, whether I was the deputy or whether I was the senior. My role was, first of all, I was the contact for my Vietnamese counterparts for tactical airstrikes, medical evacuation flights. We had some developmental project money that I had control over. So we would discuss projects uh, that he wanted some support from me, and I was there for that. Maybe most of all, at least the 3 months I was back as the district senior advisor in Ham Long, I was a morale bucker upper, a friend. Uh, my mission from my province senior advisor was restore his confidence in himself and in his soldiers. So I was not advising. The closest thing I advised on was the type of munitions that a helicopter or Air Force fast mover had for an airstrike, and what would be best use of him, and what did he need, and that's the extent of my advice.
So almost a substantial part of the job is, if I'm using this word correctly, kind of a liaison between the popular forces guys you're with in the field and U.S. air assets, and getting these two things connected when the ground forces needed air power. Is that right?
That is right. It depended again on when and where. My first 10 months, we didn't have many airstrikes at Ham Long because our security situation was relatively good. And there were other parts of the province that were not as good, and they got priority. Uh, I spent some time on training the more junior officers that I worked with, the District S3 and the District S2, on the way to deal with American airstrikes. They certainly knew how to deal with the Vietnamese Air Force, but I made them sufficiently skillful that when I wasn't there and they needed an American, they knew how to do it. Uh, so maybe that was advice and training. Uh, Early in my tour there, we still had the lowest level of military, the PSDF, uh, village defenders, if you will, older men, young kids, women. They were at the village and hamlet level. They were people that were too old or too young to be drafted into the army. They had a lot of female membership. For a very long time, it was really a ragtag outfit. They didn't get the M16s until at the end. Uh, and I didn't actually deal with them in combat even once. All I did was read about things that happened, and they either succeeded in holding off an enemy attack or they didn't. Uh, so I can't really say one way or the other, yay or nay. But when they were called upon to fight in the Battle of Tan Loy, they stayed and they fought because it was their home,
Mm.
and families depended on them. So they were there, and they were by the end of the war a lot better than they had been earlier when they were poorly armed and not very well led, and neither the Vietnamese nor the U.S. military paid a whole lot of attention.
A couple minutes ago, you said that one mission you were given was to be a morale booster. Um, if I remember correctly, a Vietnamese officer was feeling pretty down about something significant that had happened. What is the story that led to your instructions to basically, help this officer get his morale and his troops' morale back up?
I was in Ham Long as the deputy. Uh, I was officially there as the Fung Long intelligence coordinator. Uh, After about 2 weeks, it was clear to me that I was wasting my time. Uh, my boss needed me available to go on operations either with him or parallel to him to operations, so two advisors. And I was moved from that intelligence billet. I was physically moved on paper to the deputy district senior advisor slot, which was a combat infantry position. Uh, I'm sure there was a lot of soul searching on my boss's part, but when I told him I wanted to do it, he was surprised. Uh, and he said, yes, what a great idea. And he started me going out with the S2, the intel officer, and the S3, the ops officer. And he would go with the district chief. Occasionally, we would both go together. But so I had spent most of my first 10 months going to the field, mostly not too much combat, and certainly enough to, to get your blood going. But they knew that I was capable of doing what I did. When I went to Mokai, just the district senior advisor, absolutely superb officer named Byron Reed, George Byron Reed. It was the two of us, but the security situation was the worst in the province. And so the operations were larger. And whenever we went, the two of us went together. And that was, I could handle the radio and he could, whatever. In July of 1972, an NVA regiment invaded Hamlong. Same thing had happened in Mokai about 3 weeks earlier when I was on R&R. And this has been a little difficult for me to discuss, but the province S2 advisor, a fine guy and a good friend named Bill Chandler. Captain Chandler was an MI branch officer, but he was a branch transfer. He had had a previous assignment in the 9th Division as an infantry platoon leader and company commander. So although he was military intelligence and he was the province intel advisor, he had combat experience. I'm in Mokai. My district senior advisor was badly wounded in July in that other invasion. His legs were almost immobile from shrapnel wounds. He could not go to the field. So the province senior advisor didn't ask. He told Captain Chandler to go out to Ham Long and help out there, which he did. He was killed on the first day he was there, killed in action in an ambush. Devastating to everybody because you kind of thought by that time in the war maybe nothing bad would happen, but Bill was killed, and about at least 10 days later, because of other things going on, the province senior advisor called me up to Ben Trey and said, I want you to go to Ham Long and be the DSA, stay there as long as you need. Whereas Bill was going to be there for, a couple of weeks and he would come back to be the province intel advisor. So when I went back out there, the province senior advisor gave me 3 pieces of instructions. He said, my mission number 1 was to use airstrikes to the maximum and work on defeating the remains of the NVA. Number 2 was to go everywhere with the district chief. And number 3 was buck up him and his men and get their morale back up. They've been shocked by the invasion, but with you out there helping them, they can prevail. I should stay in that 10 days or so. A regiment from the 9th ARVN Division came down from Vietnam and went into Ham Long and did the job, the heavy work of pushing most of what was left of that regiment back across the river. But they left behind a number of fillers for the so-called Viet Cong units in our district and the one next to it. And equipment and newer rifles and all kinds of stuff. So they were basically almost fully NVA units now. So that's what we had to deal with. And so when the PSA said buck his mount, he was a good officer. He'd done a very fine job. He was shocked by what happened on his watch, not only the invasion, but he'd lost his second district senior advisor. Major Coddington was killed before I arrived, before my boss arrived. So he was in bad morale. He cried when I came in and reported to him. He says, I'm so glad they sent you out here to help me. It was tough for him. It was tough for me. But between us and the soldiers, we prevailed.
I'm certain you're not thinking in terms of, personal psychological strategy and things like that. But as you look back on yourself at this time, what sort of psychological tactics or strategy did you use? Because this happens, it's a blow. It's a blow to you. It's a blow to the Vietnamese officer. But you have to press on. You've got a mission right in front of you, and you can't. I'm assuming there's not a whole lot of time to spend thinking and dwelling on it. What was your own way of processing that, but then also getting on with the mission at hand?
Well, we obviously, the district chief and I had a very long conversation when I got out there. I should tell you also that I had with me my interpreter, Sergeant Bay. We'd worked together for a year in the Ninth Division and for almost all of my 18 months in Kenwood. So there were actually two of us. But for about 4 or 5 days, it was just Sergeant Bay and myself. And so I had a very, very long talk with Colonel Shun, the district chief, when I got there the first day. I mean, he says we're going to put you up here in the TOC. I had I had stopped in Bentray and gotten cots and mattresses and a PRC 10, a PRC 25 radio, and 3 or 4 boxes of C rations. And he said, "We'll put you in here." He thought it was only two of us, and when the sergeant came out a few days later, there was room for the third of us. Anyway, we talked for quite a long time. And my whole process with him was, look, he said, "I know you, we trust you, we've worked together before, we will work well today." And I said, I'm going to go with you every place. You go to the field, I'm going to the field. It's no more just me and the S2. Whenever you go, I go with you. If you're not going and you want something done, I will go with whoever you tell me to go with. And I said, hopefully we'll have a lot of airstrikes because your district is now priority 2 after Mokai. And so I think we're going to do okay. We'll get rid of these guys. And that was kind of my whole pitch. I wasn't there. He knew my background. He knew that I was an intelligence officer doing an infantry officer's job, and I'd apparently done it well with him for 10 months. I knew all of the staff. We'd all worked together. We'd all been shot at together. And it was just a really good, from the standpoint of standing back and say, how's the situation in Ham Long? I think the province senior advisor would have told General Abrams that it was pretty good. And so that's what he did. It was just, I think, being with him and him knowing that I was going to go with him, and I had a radio and I knew how to do airplanes. So, and that's what happened. We put in airstrikes almost literally every day I was there. Whereas in the first 10 months, I don't think I handled a single airstrike. If we had them, the DSA did it, but they're not very many. They were all going someplace else. We were able to get priority use of the province swing ship to do aerial surveillance and just what's going on. How does that outpost look? Does it need help? We did that a lot. And every time he needed a medevac, it was almost always a U.S. helicopter that came. So it was a good situation, and we just worked really hard together. And happily, he had a good staff. Our soldiers were just wonderful. They were as good, not as technically qualified, but they were certainly as courageous as any American soldier was. They were fighting for their own homes. They had their wives and kids in the outposts with them. So they were good soldiers.
I'm assuming that this, NVA infiltration of the Mekong is part of the Easter Offensive of 72.
It is part of the offensive, but it came very late. I mean, it started up at Easter in first, second, and third corps, and we were wondering, when is it? Who's going to come here, and whether the Vietnamese, the NVA, just didn't have enough people, or they needed time to get more infiltrators down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The regiment that came across the river, I had fought with on the 9th Division when I was there, 2 years earlier. So at almost the same time, I think it was early July, I think 6 battalions came into Mokai from across the southern river. and then 2, 3 weeks later, the other regiment came into Hamlong. I think in both cases, they were planning to take the province capital of Binh Tre. The one that came into Hamlong had a straight line, paved road and everything from Hamlong all the way to Binh Tre, and that was their mission. And they almost, they came within a kilometer of, of the district compound before they were beaten back. So, yeah, it was part of the Easter offensive, but since it didn't happen to July, it didn't get the same coverage, and it was never stitched together with happened further north.
The question that really came to my mind, and it's one of those questions where you could write a 600-page book about it. So I'm interested primarily in just how you might have answered this question if it were pitched to you in late 1972. But one of the things the main thing I thought as I read this section of your memoir, if we're talking about Quang Tri up in northern Icor in 72, all right, that makes sense. The NBA are there. The Mekong Delta in 1972. And I'm just wondering to myself, how is that possible?
Well,
That
it was, yeah,
after
it
seven
was,
years of combat, there they are in the Mekong. What's your thought?
the whole time I was there at second tour, I never had a single briefing on what the enemy situation was, either at province or at district level. I honestly did not know how many VC or NVA, the broader we was fighting in the Delta. All I knew was what I had, in my hands in Hanlong, and later what we had in Mokai. Uh, I'm sure that everybody thought that those two invasions were a complete surprise. It was certainly a surprise in Hanlong. I mean, how did they manage to get an entire regiment across the river from Din Tung province? That regiment had operated in Din Tung since the war started. And like I say, they were on our list when I was in the 9th Division. So they got all of those people across the river, and of course there were people who were saying, "Hey, there's a lot of boats in the water," and they got there. So it was a surprise in that it's not that they didn't have the capability; they did. They just hadn't shown it until then. And I suspect, I don't know what the NVA guys were told, but I think they were probably told that you're going to go into that province. It's the foundation of our movement. You're going to take over that province. You're going to frighten Saigon because the combat, the Delta has not been that heavy. As it turns out, it was heavier than people thought. It just didn't have U.S. units down there fighting them. It was always Vietnamese. The 9th Division was there for 18 months, I think. You'd have to look at that up. But and it moved around a lot with the Mobile Riverine Force. But there were always NVA in the southern tip of Vietnam, in Cam province, or Cam and An Giang, I forgot the name. Anyway, they were always there. One of our districts, further south of Mokai, on what we call the lower line, was a major NVA infiltration point. There's a monument there that I visited later after the war to the people that did all of that logistical support into the Delta. That's a huge monument. So they were there. They just were doing it a little bit different, and not as much heavy unit contact.
After this large number of NBA are in the Delta and replacing Viet Cong, um, did you discern or detect a difference in tactics? I mean, could you tell after this happens that you were dealing with a different enemy just by how they operated?
Yes and no. Certainly, the VC that we fought in Hanlong, my first 10 months were they were there. There were lots of little firefights. Most of their operations were small ambushes, propaganda, and forced impressment of personnel. Uh, there was no really big battle in my district the whole 10 months I was there at the start. A little bit different in Mokai because they had more troops, enemy troops there. and there were some events there, but everybody in Lokai knew that the VC controlled, the southernmost parts of the district and the northwestern. A lot of those places we never went. Uh, there were very few places we could go without a fairly large security escort. Uh, they were there when those invasions occurred in '72. What happened is they got more men, they got more equipment. Uh, uh, they always had good stuff, but now they had rockets and just an awful lot of weapons and ammunition, and they were fighting as companies and battalions rather than in squads and platoons and ambushing, attacking outposts. The first 10 months I was there, most of the combat was either an ambush of a Vietnamese army, a small patrol, RFPF patrol, or attacks on outposts. And they overran our outposts, I'd say 1 out of 4. They actually took it over, either because they had turncoat VC posing as RF or PF, or because they just had numerical superiority. So that was the war the first 10 months I was there. It was outpost construction and defense, and be careful for ambushes wherever you go.
You work primarily with the popular forces and the regional forces. What is the difference between these two organizations?
On the ground, there wasn't a whole lot of difference. Uh, Regular force RF soldiers, as I recall the rules, they were recruited uh, locally, and they could not be sent outside of their district.
Okay.
Popular forces were recruited locally, and I'm sorry, RF could not be sent outside of their province, and popular force also locally, and they could not be sent outside of their district. So uh, uh, that to lots of them, it was better than being drafted into the army. If you signed up to be an RF or PF, you were exempt from the draft, if you will. You were still fighting. And in our district and in most of the province, they were the only forces because we had no big urban units.
Well, you mentioned that, the RFPFs are often, called rough puffs, and sometimes that's just a name people use, and sometimes it is kind of pejorative. But there's no question that among Vietnam vets, um, generally speaking, there's a pretty low view of South Vietnamese forces. What I have noticed is that among advisors, um, that's different. Um, I'm curious as to why that is, and so I'm interested in exploring that with you. But you recognize that there were problems. One of the problems being you can't know with certainty who's with the VC and who's not. I mean, in a lot of cases, and I'll ask you about that. But you do generally have a high view, a very high view of the popular forces, regional forces you worked with. So, what accounts for the high view you have? What did you see? What did you experience that leads you all these decades later to speak of them in a sense of high regard?
Well, I'll start by saying again, it depended on where you were and when you were there. And there's no question that there were parts of Vietnam that the RFPF were not very, very good. And I suppose that depended on Vietnamese leadership in those areas and training and how much attention they got. But throughout Ham Long, throughout Ken Long, all of the districts are the same. They didn't have any ARPAN units there. The RFPF is all you had. They were defending the entire province. And so, in my view, and the ones that I worked with, they were just every bit as courageous as an American soldier could be. They were perhaps a little bit more realistic. They were there for the duration, and the American was there for a year. But in either case, if they got killed or wounded, it was a huge thing. It was the family losing their leader. It was one less soldier. So in Ham Long, which is where I spent the most of my time, they were good soldiers, and they went to the field and they went on operations and they combated against very well trained Vietnamese and later NVA soldiers. They had to. It was either fight or lose your family or yourself, obviously, or there was no alternative. They had no place to go.
Sure.
You couldn't retreat to a big base camp or anything like that.
Right.
And they often, especially the RF, especially the PF, that had the smaller and hopefully not quite as exposed outposts, they often had their family in the outpost with them rather than a nearby village. So they were fighting for their family right there and right next to them. So I just had every bit of respect for them. I thought they fought well. They were generally well led. If any had a problem, it was by leadership. The field soldier himself was courageous and willing to fight. So we we evaluated, and we had a report we had to do every month to TEFARs, to pre total force, technical force. Anyway, it was one of the reports advisors had to do, and we had to rate our units. And so between the district chief and the rest of the staff and the few advisors that were there, we kind of knew which villages or which hamlets were in better condition security wise because of the strength of their soldiers, and which were not so well off and kind of problem areas. The PF are almost entirely in self-defense positions within a hamlet or village, or they were in a smaller outpost, and it was usual to have 8 or 10 men manning an outpost. And so if the VC attacked with a 20-person platoon, chances were we're going to lose that outpost unless we got artillery or relief force en route quick enough. And we won some and we lost some because of that. But we never lost an RF outpost because they were a bit stronger, a bit larger, and they had more soldiers.
You've a number of times you've referred to the motivation that these RF and PF soldiers had, and referring to family and home. Did you ever pick up in your 18 months any sense of ideological fervor as well? Because of course, from the perspective of American policy, we got into this war because it's part of the global struggle against communism. On the ground, is that how these soldiers talked, or was it, I'm fighting because these Viet Cong are a threat to our home?
Personal view. I don't know what the in my view, there was no ideology involved at all. They weren't fighting for the national defense of Vietnam. They weren't fighting for capitalism versus communism. They were fighting for their family, for their home village, for the guys to the right and left of them in the outpost. There was no ideology on the battlefield. They had an enemy, and they didn't care who was what. They were the enemy, and so we're going to fight them. Uh, yeah, that was pretty clear to me. I might have misunderstood the whole thing, but it was at least what it appeared to me. They were fighting for, just like the American soldiers by the end of the war, they were fighting for the guy in the foxhole with them. They weren't fighting for uh, defeat of communism or the domino theory or anything like that. They were fighting for their buddies.
Yeah, actually, as you were speaking, I was thinking of by now the hundreds of times I've heard American combatants say, when the bullets fly, philosophy doesn't matter. You're fighting for yourself and the soldier next to you, and that's pretty much all the war's about.
Even my first tour, I don't remember a whole lot of discussions, at the mess hall or anything about that. It was the same thing.
Yeah,
We got to go out and get these guys before they get us. It wasn't yay, yay, wave the flag. That may have been that way at the start of the war, but I wasn't there then.
right.
So uh, personal views only. There was no philosophy on the battlefield.
That fits with everything I've heard over the past 30 years. So I think there's I think
Well, if you talk to a North Vietnamese guy coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, he would probably a little bit more indoctrinated than the guys in South Vietnam, just because of the system of government. And they were tough soldiers. I was very realistic. as far as I was concerned, the enemy was as good as I was, and we just had to be faster or smarter, or I would have more bombs. It wasn't even then. It wasn't ideology. They were the bad guys. I was a good guy, and that's how I fought. And I think uh, the RFPF guys that I fought with were the same way.
The NVA were the bad guys, but I mean, do you agree that you do have to kind of stand in a certain, or think of them with a certain degree of awe? I mean, they've come all the way down from North Vietnam on that trail.
Absolutely.
Here
I
they are.
respected them as good soldiers.
Yeah.
I underestimate them. They had a lot rougher situation than I did. Like you say, they'd walked, rode a very long way, lots of disease, lots of problems, and they were obviously well motivated. If anything, the fact that they were told they were going down there to unify the country, which was never part of the South Vietnamese indoctrination, as far as I know, they weren't under any illusions that they were going to unify Vietnam by beating the VC. So I don't know how much ideology entered into an NBA soldiers when he was attacking one of our outposts, and I didn't care. He was he was the enemy, and I hope that my airstrike got him good. The Vietnamese leadership in the places, especially in Hanoi, were absolutely professional about dealing with the Americans. They they valued the fact. When I went back out as a DSA in July of '72, I had known Lieutenant Colonel Shan when I was a captain as the deputy, and he had a major who was his senior advisor. So he had known me as the deputy, even though I went to the field with him and his officers. I had a bit of concern when I went back out as the district senior advisor, how it would work with a captain being the advisor to a lieutenant colonel. In some of the districts, that was a problem. It had been a problem in Mokai the first half of my assignment because the district senior advisor in Mokai was a very, very capable and very mature captain, but the district chief was a lieutenant colonel, and he just couldn't stand the fact that his advisor was a captain. So I had that in the back of my mind. How is he going to treat me? And as I say, when I got there, he cried and said, "I'm so glad they sent you out here. We know you and we trust you." And I always treated him as my senior. I always called him sir. Uh, I gave him every bit of respect so that his soldiers and his officers would see that I was his junior, and uh, and it worked beautifully. When he said, "Tomorrow we're going to go here and we're going to rebuild an outpost, or uh, do this, that, or the other. We think that there's a VC company over here. Uh, can you arrange tactical air support?" And I would do that. My very first contact took place in I can't remember, it was in September, I think. I got there in July, and we thought it was just going to be a small operation, and they did have a target. They said we have a squad or two of VC, and they've got the small base camp, and we're going to go get it. But nonetheless, we were ambushed, and it was textbook. The S2 was commanding the operation. He's on the radio, moving his forces around to flank what would turned out to be a bunker full of VC. And we didn't have any airplanes. I had called and said, "Can we get some air support?" I finally got an observer flight to come out to try and follow them. But he did everything right. And I was doing my very best to use up all of my ammo. And the soldiers were firing with control and not wasting ammo. And it was a good battle. We killed 4. The S2 said that I'd killed him because I was such a good shot. I doubt that, but that was the credit. But he did everything right. He did everything right. And when I needed to call province, I always carried the radio. I didn't have an NCO or an interpreter carrying my radio. I just carried it myself. And And I was able, he knew I had called for air support and we couldn't get in. So that's just the way it was.
One of the, I mean, really complicated things that comes up in your memoir a number of times is, how it turns out that some of these popular forces were VC. And then I forget the details, but there's one story where you've got two guys with you. And if you could maybe just tell this story, they're very close to you. Um, you trust them and go along with, and I forget the details, but you find out afterwards that they're Viet Cong.
Yep.
Um, you know, just this situation where, I mean, at least a couple times, I think you refer to PF forces being overrun or wiped out or close to wiped out, and it turns out that maybe half of them actually were Viet Cong.
Mhm.
That's a really complicated situation. So I just wonder if you could just reflect on that situation of who can we know? We can't know if a lot of these guys are Viet Cong, and we've got experience that a number of them are. And then this one particular story where you've got a couple guys who are, I forget exactly what's going on, but you find out after the fact that they also were
Yep.
Viet Cong, but they were with you.
Yes. I think most of the advisors thought that about a third of the people in their compound or in their district were VC or VC influenced. But we had absolutely no way to determine that, nor did the
Right.
district chief or his S2. We had a military security service, MSS, uh, uh, very small team in our district. And of course, they were the security guys. They're, the equivalent of background investigations.
Yeah.
And I asked the lieutenant one time, I said, how many of the guys here in the compound are VC? He says, oh, I don't think there's any, at least not too many. um, this, this was a case everywhere. We did not know, nor did the Vietnamese know at any given moment who was a VC and who was not. So when I went back out as the district senior advisor in Ham Long, and I met Colonel Shun and we had our emotional discussion, and he takes me and he says, "We're going to give you what I knew was the tactical operations center, the admin tactical operations center. It was a concrete a room at the end of a concrete building, and in that we put our cots, and he gave us a Prick 25 radio that they had used, and he said you can have this, and I had brought the PRC 25 from Province, so we had a radio in there, and anyway, and then he calls over two soldiers who I had worked with, my previous 10 months, and he said these guys are going to be your bodyguards.
Are you bodyguards? Good
Your
grief.
bodyguards. They are going to guard the TOC while you're sleeping, and they're going to go with you on operations, and they're going to carry your radio and anything else you need them to do. And I said, well, no, I'll carry the radio. Thank you very much. And they did. It was either one or both of them with me on every operation we went on. And I knew they were outside at night because occasionally when, I'd wake up in the night and you'd hear them either talking or moving around or something. So they were outside all night, every night. They had a shift, obviously. One Arvin Sergeant who had been the Ham Long interpreter, one of them, and he was promoted to go to province and be a province interpreter. And he and I had stayed in touch even during the war and after the war. Uh, and when I started going back to Vietnam, my very first time back, I found him in Saigon. Mr. Tri, uh, after 4 or 5 or 6 visits, I mean, quite a few years after I started going back. My first trip back was in 1995. So let's say 5 years later. I finally asked him, I said, now you were an Arvin sergeant. How much time did you spend in re-education? And he get kind of shamefaced look on his face. And he says, well, Dai, he said, one of my sisters was a VC cadre, and she was able to get me out after about 3 months. He said, but I was never a VC. I never worked for him, and I never told anybody what my sister obviously had a different family name. And I that gave me the courage to say, okay, how many people did I know who turned out to be VC at the end of the war. He says, oh, Dai Wei, there were many. And he named several. And one of them had been one of the district staff officers, primary staff. One had been the roving district chief that when someone went on leave, he would, temporary. And he said, you remember those two guys that were your bodyguards? He said, they were VC all along. So it was years after the war that I found this out. I said, why am I still alive? They could have killed me on any operation and said it was a VC. They could have thrown a grenade through the door into the TOC where we slept. But he said, well, there were many, many reasons. He said, first of all, the VC did not want advisors assassinated because there would be a huge investigation and they might either find the VC who did the assassination or they would find other VC through their investigation. And it was more important to the VC command to have those spies in place than it was to have them identified as having assassinated an advisor. He said, now, if you were killed in a firefight, that was okay. If your Jeep hit a mine and killed you, that was okay. But you could not be assassinated. So, okay, these guys are with me on operation. We had a lot of firefights. I suppose they could have shot me, but I obviously had been told not to. So he said, secondly, he said, Dai Wei, you're a nice person. Everybody liked you, even the VC. And I kind of said, I'm glad I'm a nice guy. I found that second reason a little bit specious, but that's what he said. Our deputy province senior advisor was a comparatively young guy. He was my age, but he spoke fluent Vietnamese, and he had been a district senior advisor in one of our districts on a previous tour. He was a USAID State Department guy, honest to God, not a CIA guy. And he became the deputy district province chief for pacification, and he was sitting out in a park on a bench one evening having a glass of juice or something. And a Vietnamese guy came up and sat down beside him, and he says, I'm I forgot his name. Let's say Ha. I'm Ong Ha. And told him what his VC assignment was. He says, we know who you are. And this is all in Vietnamese. He knew, obviously, that my friend spoke Vietnamese. And he said, but we're not going to hurt you because you do good things. And we know about your project at the school, and we know that you got the swimming pool repaired and that you do this, that, and the other. So I just wanted to let you know that we, the broader we, know who you are. And then he got up and left. And Norris was dumbstruck. But they
Yeah.
knew who we were. They could have taken us whenever they wanted.
Mm. You mentioned Bill Chandler, and that gave us a chance to remember him. And it also, introduced the theme of the NBA incursion into the Mekong. Um, I'm wondering if you're willing to just tell us about the work of Vincent Anderson.
Okay. The first 10 months I was in Ham Long, we hardly ever did airstrikes because, like I say, we were lowest priority, and we just never had any. I went off to school, district senior advisor sent me off to school about 3 weeks after I got there to learn how to do that. And so I knew how to do it, but I'd never had to do it until later in my career. And we had this most wonderful crew of forward air controllers. I think they either lived in Finlong or in Canto, and their headquarters, of course, was in Saigon. And they were the ones that we talked with to get airstrikes. We'd call province and say we need an airstrike, and sooner or later, a guy would come on the radio and say hi there, or words of that effect, and we would explain what we needed to do, and what was available, and then we would conduct the airstrike. I did that a lot the 3 months I was in Ham Long as a DSA. They're just absolutely wonderful. So were the helicopter pilots. I love every single Army helicopter. crewmen. They came whenever we needed them, whether it was night or day, TOTS, LZ or not. They, whether it was a medevac or whatever, they always came when we called. Uh, you mentioned one particular person. This is tough. uh, I was back in Wokai after being the DSA in Hemlock. I can't forget exactly when it happened. Uh, and the next door district was conducting airstrikes along the district boundary, but it was his airstrike as opposed to Mokai's airstrike. Uh, but we were monitoring the net very closely because well, maybe it would move into our district. And then we got a radio call from province saying, "Has anyone heard of a FAC crashing? We've lost contact with the FAC." And the answer we had, of course, was no. We had followed it, but we had no knowledge. And then we started getting messages in the Vietnamese TOC in our district from PF units saying we want to go look for the crash. We heard a crash. We want to go help the pilot. From both districts, both Hung Mi and us. What actually happened was the province chief, province senior advisor sent our Kit Carson Scout platoon had a lieutenant commanding it. And they had a pretty good idea of where it had happened by all of these reports. And they went in on the ground and they found the crash site. The fact that the young lieutenant took it on himself, he saw a sampan that was where it shouldn't have been, knew it was an enemy sampan, and he was going in. He radioed he was going in to fire on a sampan. And so that was kind of the clue that they knew about where he was. And of course, that was the last they heard of him. And so we lost. He was the only FAC that was killed during my assignment there. And he was doing it to help our soldiers. And the really tragic thing was that the commander of the Kit Carson Scout platoon and that lieutenant had been personal friends. And so he had to go in and find the body of his friend. And that was what hit all of us really hard. Lieutenant Lim, Nguyen Thanh Lim, was the Ham Long S3 operations officer. And he was kind of my mentor when I went and told my boss that I wanted to go to the field and not sit in the desk. And he said, "Okay, go see Chung Mi Lim and tell him what you want to do, and he'll probably be the scheduler, and we'll know." And so I went to see him, and he was a really fine guy. We became friends. Very, very confident officer. He taught me an awful lot about tactical operations in a very rural district. He was killed in March of '73, right after the ceasefire. There was no ceasefire. They had NVA or VC attacked an outpost he was out working in, and he was killed by a mortar round. He had a very large family, and I was able to send some money through Colonel Sean to his father. He was just one of really, really fine people I worked with.
When I say to you, Sergeant Bay, what's that? What's his story?
I met Sergeant Bay in 1968 when I was in Dongtan with the 9th MI detachment. He was one of my counterintelligence interpreters. Young guy, beautiful English, probably at that time 23, 24. His nickname from both the other Vietnamese and us was Tiger by his personality. And he was a Wahao. So he was adamantly against the VC. And he was just a great interpreter, great person. We got to be friends. When one of the districts in Din Tung province had to take over the Phung Long Phoenix program, he didn't have any intelligence guys. And he actually showed up at my office one day and asked if he could borrow one of my men for, like a month or two to get him set up. And so I lent him one of my NCOs, and I sent Sergeant Bay with him. We made some very strict rules, and neither one of them was to go to the field. They had not been trained or equipped for combat operations, and it worked out well. And they came back, and fast forward, I'm in Ham Long in July of 71, and we had really good interpreters. We had three, and I heard at one of the province meetings that one of the officers from another district came up to me and said, "Do you know a guy named Bay?" And I said, "I certainly do. Why?" He says, "Well, he's one of our interpreters, but he's not getting along too well with the district senior advisor." And I said, "Hey, let me chat with my boss. Maybe we can trade." And we did. So after about 2 months, Sergeant Bay came to Ham Long, and he stayed with me for the rest of the assignment. He went with me. He was an ARVN sergeant, so he had to go to the province chief and ask each time I moved that he could go with me. And so he went to Mokai with me. He went back to Ham Long with me. He went back to Mokai with me. He stood on the helipad when I was finally pulled out to go home and have the ceasefire in February of 73. And then he was reassigned back to his home province. He was an ARVN, not an RF. And when I went back in 74 through communications, I was able to, the other interpreter that I mentioned uh, got me in touch with Bay, and I went to Ben Trey, and the new advisor there put me in touch with Colonel Shun, who was now Colonel Shun and province chief in Vinh Vinh province across the river. I got him on the phone, and he said, "Come on down for a visit." So Sergeant Try and I got on a bus. I told you things were a lot better in 74. We got on a bus, went down, and Colonel Shun had sent a Jeep convoy to meet me at the ferry. That was before the bridges went across the Mekong. And I spent 3 days. Sergeant Bay came down the second day. He got time off. And so two of my interpreters and I spent 3 days as guests of the province chief in his house.
Wow.
And it's time for me to go on to Thailand, and we had to say goodbye. But Bay did give me his military mailing address. And I stayed in touch with both of those guys from Thailand. And one day, or at some point, the letters from Bay stopped coming. And I found out quite a bit later that he had been killed in an operation in the Seven Mountains area. And there was no way for them to get a hold of me. So probably my single best friend during those times was Sergeant Bay.
When you flew out of South Vietnam for the second time, you come back. I mean, I've never heard this before. You come back in 1974, and you say that conditions on the ground seem better in 74 than they did in 73.
Yeah, like I say, we took a bus. I mean, the province senior, they didn't call them advisors anymore, but the province officer in Ben Tray said, "You shouldn't have any trouble at all. Just take a bus." And so we did.
And
Uh, Colonel Shun did send a 3 vehicle convoy to pick me up, pick us, the two of us up. So things in Vinh Vinh may not have been quite as good, but we didn't have any problems. And then he drove me, or he had a Jeep, just a Jeep, drive me all the way back to Saigon after our visit.
wow.
So things appeared to be better.
When you return to the Mekong in 1974, it seemed that things were better than they'd been in 73. And then you make your way to Thailand for your next assignment. Experiencing what you did in the Mekong in 74, would you say that you felt hopeful that, maybe South Vietnam will stand?
In a way, I think several of us thought that the Delta would stay free. But of course, the NVA were able to move tanks down the highways through the Ho Chi Minh Trail, down the highways through Cambodia, and they came into the Delta from Phnom Penh. and it was all very quick, as you know.
Yeah.
Uh, it sort of made a wishful thinking, perhaps not a realistic view, but like a lot of people, I'd put a lot of me into that advisory assignment, and I think we always kind of hoped that it'd work out. I did know that Colonel Shum uh, was captured. He went 13 years in re-education. He actually got to the U.S. by being maybe the last province officer he worked for in Vin Bin. But I was told unequivocally not to visit him because his mind had been completely destroyed by his experience.
In the
And
re-education camp?
yeah, and that it would my visit would upset him and it would upset me, and that it probably wasn't a good idea. And so I didn't have a chance to see him, and then he passed away. Uh, Sergeant Bay was killed. Sergeant Try survived and survived, even though his sister was a VC. He survived by teaching English as a tutor. He couldn't get he wanted to be a school teacher. He couldn't because he was unarmed.